I'm now 57, and I always believed that my 26-year marriage to Ruby, my college sweetheart, was unshakable. Ruby wasn't just my wife. She was my confidant and best friend from our college days. We had a decade-long friendship before deciding to get married. We were close friends for 2 years before I mustered the courage to court her, and a year later, we were a couple. Our years together were filled with beautiful moments. However, work commitments meant we had to live in different cities for several years. Despite the challenges of separation, Ruby and I managed to keep our bond strong. She was more than just a loving spouse and the mother of our children. She was my closest ally from college, understanding me like no one else. Her betrayal hit me hard because of this deep connection. Just last week, we attended our college's alumni reunion, an event that celebrates our graduation from 35 years ago. It's a significant gathering with performances by well-known singers and celebrities, eagerly awaited by all alumni. This year, our group got the opportunity to reconnect and see how we've all changed. Ruby and I were particularly thrilled since we were one of the few couples who found love in college and stayed together through the years. We walked into the event full of pride, eager to show off our enduring relationship. But little did I know, this excitement would soon turn into a nightmare. We were overjoyed to be reunited with our old friends after so many years. The atmosphere was buzzing with laughter and chatter, and we felt like we were on top of the world. However, our joy was abruptly interrupted by a familiar face. Steve, a former classmate who had always harbored a deep admiration for Ruby during our college years. Ruby had always attracted a lot of attention with her intelligence and charm, and I wasn't the only one drawn to her. But Steve stood out because his pursuit of her was intense and persistent, going beyond mere flirting. Despite Ruby's clear lack of interest, Steve never gave up on trying to win her over, even after knowing about our relationship and her love for me. I was always confident in our relationship and didn't let Steve's advances bother me, knowing our bond was strong. Steve and everyone else knew how exceptional Ruby was, yet he continued his pursuit. I clearly remember the day Steve found out Ruby had chosen to marry me. He approached me with a message, suggesting that Ruby had made a huge mistake, expecting me to take care of her as well as he thought he could. Ruby and I found his childishness amusing and laughed it off. After that incident, we didn't see Steve again and assumed he had finally moved on. After all, 35 years had passed since college, and we had been happily married for 26 of those years. But to our surprise, Steve showed up at the reunion, still fixated on his college infatuation with Ruby. When he greeted us with a warm hug, we reciprocated, but Ruby chose to shake hands, unsettled by his intense gaze. Steve sat across from Ruby, and his stare drew the attention of everyone in the room. To ease the tension, I asked if he had brought his family to the reunion, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. Surprisingly, he revealed that he had been briefly married at 40, but was currently single. Steve admitted his marriage ended in divorce, and I offered my sympathy. His response, however, carried a bitter edge. "Well, you should be sorry. After all, you stole my love." His absurd statement was followed by hysterical laughter. In my younger days, such provocations might have led to a fight. But as we approached 60, these matters seemed trivial. Steve's lack of intimidation allowed him to shrug off his comments. He was the kind of guy who wouldn't be picked for a sports team, a brash talker whose jokes missed the mark. Everyone heard his insensitive remark, but no one reacted, and an uncomfortable silence followed. Trying to diffuse the situation, we decided to ignore him. It was clear Ruby was particularly affected by his words, and her silence spoke volumes. Our close friend Maya noticed Ruby's distress and took her aside. We tried to lift her spirits, advising her not to let an obsessed individual ruin her evening. Knowing Ruby's tendency to overthink, we comforted her, wanting to see her smile again. We did our best to help her recover and calm down. Unexpectedly, Steve approached us again, seemingly eavesdropping on our conversation. To our surprise, he apologized, claiming he didn't intend to upset Ruby. On the contrary, he wanted to remind her that she still had an admirer despite the years and their impact on her appearance. I was furious at his rudeness, but kept my composure, firmly telling him to leave us alone. Steve seemed genuinely sorry, and Ruby firmly asked him to give us space. But Steve persisted, urging Ruby to forgive him so we could all enjoy the reunion. His words struck a chord with me, making me realize it was time to let go of the past. This evening marked the end of our meetings with old friends and classmates, underscoring the futility of clinging to bygone days. Recognizing this, Ruby embraced Steve, telling him to let go of their past and not to approach her again. With that, we headed to the dance floor to enjoy the celebration. As others joined us, the atmosphere became more festive. After a while, I noticed Maya and Ruby talking, with Steve nearby. He was animatedly chatting and even dancing in a silly manner. Despite his antics, I was relieved that the earlier tension had eased, allowing us to reflect on our shared history in a positive light. Throughout the evening, I kept an eye on Ruby to gauge her feelings. I noticed Steve whispering to her and hoped it was nothing concerning. Ruby's smile and nod in response eased my worries. I assumed their conversation was innocent. If Steve had crossed a line, Ruby would have put him in his place immediately. With that reassurance, I let my guard down and immersed myself in the evening, catching up with friends and enjoying the festive atmosphere. However, after about an hour, I realized that both Ruby and Maya were nowhere to be found. Initially, I didn't worry, thinking they were just mingling with old friends. But as time dragged on and they still hadn't returned, my concern grew. I started searching for them, my anxiety increasing with each passing minute. I tried calling them, but the loud music at the event likely drowned out the ringing. After what felt like an eternity, Ruby finally reappeared, but something was undeniably wrong. She looked the same, but her demeanor was completely different. She was quiet, distant, and seemed agitated. She insisted we leave the event immediately, which was very unlike her. Maya soon joined us, but the two of them didn't speak a word to each other. The tension between them was palpable. It was clear something had happened. I tried to get Ruby to explain why she was so upset and eager to leave, but she remained silent. Despite wanting to stay and enjoy the rest of the evening, Ruby's insistence on leaving forced us to cut the night short. During the drive home, Ruby was uncharacteristically silent, and my worry deepened. I asked her repeatedly if she was okay, but all she would say was that she was tired and needed rest. This sudden change in her behavior was alarming. Not knowing what had happened, I felt a growing sense of dread. I mustered the courage to ask if something had happened with Maya, but Ruby's curt reply of no offered no clarity. Once we got home, I decided to give her some space, hoping she would open up when she was ready. Meanwhile, our classmates were posting photos and sharing stories from the reunion on social media, but I couldn't shake a deep sense of unease. I feared this might be our last reunion. Ruby quietly went to bed, closing her eyes as if to shut out the world. Exhausted, I finally went to bed around 2 o'clock in the morning and quickly fell asleep. Not long after, I was jolted awake by Ruby's sobbing. She was in tears, seeking comfort in my arms. I held her close, gently stroking her back, and asked if the reunion had stirred up painful memories. She didn't respond, just continued to cry. Realizing words weren't enough, I held her tighter, offering silent support and understanding. I allowed her to express her emotions, hoping my presence would provide some comfort. Eventually her sobs subsided, and she made a confession that left me stunned. She admitted she had cheated on me, and it wasn't with just anyone, it was with Steve. I was paralyzed with shock, unable to process what she was saying. Images from the previous evening flashed through my mind. The last time I saw Ruby, she was dancing with Steve and Maya, forming an unexpected trio. Her grim expression when she returned and insisted on leaving suddenly made sense. Maya had known, and that explained her distress. Feeling helpless and at a loss for words, I stood frozen. Ruby, sensing my turmoil, began to explain. She said that while they were dancing, Steve had apologized for putting her in an awkward situation after she had rejected him multiple times. Then he showered her with compliments, admiring her strength and resilience. During the dance, Steve confessed that despite traveling the world, he had never met anyone as extraordinary as her. She admitted his sincerity charmed her, and she enjoyed the attention. Steve then invited her for a walk, promising it would be their last meeting. He insisted she deserved to hear his unfiltered thoughts about her. Initially, Ruby refused, but he kept pressing, emphasizing it was a chance to hear his true feelings. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to join him, wanting to know what he had to say. They walked on the serene college campus, looking for some quiet. During their walk, Steve confessed his long-standing love for her, and that he still considered her the most extraordinary woman he had ever met. Their conversation touched on many topics, but the essence remained the same. Ruby admitted she had been influenced by alcohol and foolishly let his words sway her. During their walk, Steve gently held her hands, complicating the situation and weighing heavily on Ruby's heart. Tears welled up in her eyes as she recounted every intimate moment between them. Her confession was like a dagger to my heart, each word cutting deeper. She described in painful detail how guilt eventually took over, making her push him away. I felt utterly powerless and couldn't find the words to respond. Trying to collect my thoughts, I asked Ruby for some time alone. Despite my request, she continued to cry and beg for forgiveness. In an effort to calm her, I suggested she rest, promising we could talk in the morning. As she clung to me, fearing she had lost our connection, I remained still, lost in deep thought. My mind replayed the night's events, examining every detail until one moment stood out. I remembered Steve's unsettling, triumphant smile when Ruby returned. At the time, I didn't grasp its significance, but now I realized it was a smile of victory, as if he had finally claimed her. This realization filled me with anger and disgust, overshadowing any self-pity. Sharing a bed with Ruby became unbearable. After she finally fell into a deep sleep following hours of sobbing, I quietly got out of bed and packed my laptop, wallet, and other essentials into a backpack. The weight of my emotions was crushing as I made the agonizing decision to leave our home, despite everything. Despite everything, I couldn't ignore the deep love I still felt for Ruby after 26 years of marriage. Imagining life without her was almost impossible. Our marriage had given us a beautiful family, filled with love and cherished memories. But even with our strong bond, I knew I had to leave. Ruby's persuasive nature and intimate knowledge of me would likely prevent me from leaving if I stayed until morning. Seeking refuge, I checked into a hotel and took immediate steps to block her from contacting me, and removed her from all my social networks. Exhausted, I collapsed into a deep sleep as the sun began to rise. By 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone was ringing nonstop. Our children, unaware of the chaos between their parents, were trying to reach me. We have 2 kids, a 24-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter, both attending the same college. Reflecting on that night, I now realized that my decision to leave needed more careful planning. Pretending everything was normal after her betrayal was impossible. She was my best friend, my soulmate, and trying to deceive her would be futile since she knew me better than anyone. Her betrayal had blindsided me, and I hadn't prepared for such a scenario. When our children started calling, I was caught off guard and didn't know how to explain the devastating truth. I decided to speak to my son first, as he typically handles situations more calmly and maturely. With a heavy heart, I told him that his mother had cheated on me the previous night with someone from her past, an old admirer or possibly a stalker. I explained that I needed time to sort things out and get my bearings. This revelation shocked him to his core. The thought of his mother being capable of such betrayal was incomprehensible, making the situation even more painful. Our family had always been known for its strength and love. Friends and relatives admired our close bond. Now all of that was in ruins because of Ruby's actions. My son couldn't accept that his mother was capable of such behavior and insisted there must be some misunderstanding. Desperate for answers, he pressed me for details, trying to understand how and why this betrayal had occurred. Recognizing the emotional toll this was taking on him, I realized that providing a detailed account would only deepen his pain. With a heavy heart, I acknowledged the gravity of the situation and expressed my sincere hope that it was all a bad dream. Sadly, I had to tell him that his mother had indeed confessed to her infidelity. Although he was 24 and had experienced heartbreak before, this betrayal hit him harder than anything else. Seeking understanding and trust, I asked him to keep this information confidential until I was ready to share it with others. To avoid further questions and concerns, I told my daughter that I was away on a business trip due to work-related stress. Consequently, the calls from our children stopped. The situation was now clear. While my daughter believed I had left for work, my son and Ruby knew we were separated. In the following days, I immersed myself in online research, seeking the best lawyers and solutions to our predicament. During this time, I stumbled upon a subreddit where men shared their experiences dealing with similar issues. As I delved into these discussions, I found stories of people plotting revenge on their unfaithful partners. While I understood their anger, I couldn't bring myself to seek revenge on Ruby. Deep down, my love for her remained. Denying that would be dishonest. But despite this love, I knew we could never be together again. Trust had been shattered beyond repair, and reconciliation seemed impossible. It was painful, but our paths had irreversibly diverged. As I grappled with how to handle this challenging situation, I wasn't sure if I could overcome it. There were numerous matters demanding my attention: work, the well-being of our children, property issues, and more. Tomorrow, I had a crucial meeting with a lawyer who would guide me through the legal aspects. Ruby and I were both management consultants, but in our early 40s, we left our stable jobs. Ruby pursued her passion for writing, while I became a business consultant, primarily working with startups. As a self-employed consultant, I didn't have a fixed workplace, which made me worry about Ruby showing up unannounced. After careful consideration, I realized that given my work situation, it might not be easy for Ruby to find me. Although I occasionally work from home, I also visit clients' offices, working with multiple clients simultaneously. This made it challenging to maintain complete anonymity. Nevertheless, Ruby hadn't managed to track me down. Approaching our 60s, we had begun contemplating retirement. We had put significant effort into planning our future, including saving to buy a beachfront home in the countryside. We aimed to make this purchase next year and had already identified potential properties that matched our desire for a peaceful retirement. Fortunately, we hadn't finalized the purchase of the beach house and were still negotiating with property owners. In hindsight, I'm incredibly thankful for this. If we had already bought the property, the situation would have been much more complicated. Just the thought is daunting. Meanwhile, Ruby has been relentless in trying to contact me since I decided to keep my distance. I consulted with a lawyer who advised me to inform our adult children about our separation. He also raised questions about property division. Initially, I considered splitting it equally between Ruby and me, but upon reflection, I realized I needed to rethink my stance. Instead of seeking revenge by denying Ruby her share of our property, I decided to do the opposite. I believe she deserved her rightful half, as she had contributed as much as I had. However, I acknowledged that she also deserved the separation she sought. Having known Ruby for so long, I understood that holding on to anger and bitterness would only prolong the pain for both of us. I realized that Ruby would be ready to give up her share of the property to reconcile and preserve our family. As the divorce papers were being finalized, I organized a meeting with our children. I asked my son to secretly bring my daughter to a restaurant without informing her that I would be there. When my daughter saw me, she was visibly upset and immediately started asking questions, including whether I had cheated on her mother since I had vanished from their lives. Her distress was heart-wrenching, but I knew I had to stay composed for the sake of the children and the impending revelations. Gradually, I reassured her that I hadn't been involved with anyone else. Then, cautiously, I began to reveal the truth, bit by bit. My son already had some understanding of the situation, but my daughter was hearing the full story for the first time. Neither of them was ready to learn that their mother had been unfaithful to me. For the past 2 weeks since I left, my daughter had been living with Ruby. Overwhelmed with emotion, she hugged me tightly and tearfully apologized for any negative feelings she had harbored against me. In a vulnerable moment, my children pleaded with me to reconsider and give our marriage another chance, but I stood firm in my decision to go through with the divorce. It was incredibly difficult to see them cry, but they understood the depth of my pain and recognized the need to prioritize my well-being. I assured them that the decision to separate was solely between me and their mother and wouldn't affect our love and support for them. My daughter expressed concern for Ruby's well-being, explaining that she was struggling with eating and sleeping. She mentioned that Ruby had been swinging between bouts of crying and restlessness, calling me incessantly and searching for me at my clients' offices. Every client informed her that I hadn't been there for the past 2 weeks. Recognizing her mother's anxiety, my daughter had bravely asked Ruby if something had happened between us. Ruby's response was silence and more tears. Unable to calm down, my daughter retreated to her room, overwhelmed by sadness. Aware of the emotional toll this was taking on our children, I asked my daughter to stay home and support her mother during the divorce process. As we discussed Ruby's actions, I saw a shift in my children. Their initial sadness gave way to anger as they felt the weight of betrayal by their mother. They bore the heavy burden of our family's breakdown. In this situation, we were all victims. But the blame for our shattered family lay solely with Ruby. Despite the pain and betrayal, I didn't want my children to harbor hatred toward their mother. Instead, I urged them to support her through this challenging time. Then something surprising happened. A few days later, I received a message from Steve. He inquired about Ruby's well-being and brazenly stated that if I was divorcing her, he was ready to take her for himself. I responded by making it clear that Ruby was free to make her own choices. After this exchange, I promptly blocked him, cutting off any further contact. Strangely, Steve's message didn't provoke much anger in me. I refused to let this intruder manipulate my emotions. I was never married to him, didn't love him, and didn't trust him. My deep connection was with Ruby, which is why her betrayal hurt so much. The emotional aftermath of her actions was my primary concern. If she wanted to continue her relationship with Steve, it didn't matter to me since the divorce papers were already on their way. I awaited my daughter's call to hear how Ruby reacted to this development. Meanwhile, I had many pressing issues to address, including property division, retirement planning, and ensuring the well-being of our children. These tasks required careful thought and resolution as I worked to build a stable future. Time passed, and it was a stressful period as I tried to resolve various matters. Now, I can finally say that my divorce is official. When Ruby received the divorce papers, her illusion of my temporary anger was shattered. The harsh reality hit her hard. She had believed my anger would pass and we would reconcile, but receiving the documents burst that bubble. She persistently requested a meeting before signing the papers, convinced she could change my mind. She was right. If I had agreed to meet her, her persuasive charm might have swayed me, but I stood firm, prioritizing my emotional health. Despite still loving Ruby deeply and finding it painful to witness her deteriorating condition, I couldn't ignore the damage she had done to our family. She had taken me for granted, destroying the foundation of our once strong love. As much as I wanted to save her from becoming a shell of her former self, I knew I couldn't continue living in such a toxic environment. My daughter contacted me, expressing concern about Ruby's fragile state and informing me that Ruby had been hospitalized for depression. The financial burden caused by her actions further convinced me that, despite the difficulty of watching her suffer, I had made the right choice. Ruby's refusal to take any medication or supplements to maintain her health worsened her condition, leading to her being placed on a liquid diet. Some might see my actions as cold and uncaring towards Ruby's declining health, thinking me ruthless and selfish. They might question whether I ever truly loved her. To those conclusions, I would say this. Unless you've felt the deep sting of betrayal, it's hard to fully understand the pain I've endured and the complex emotions I've faced. Describing my love for Ruby as mere adoration would be an understatement. I adored her, cherished her, and saw her as my soulmate. We spent nearly 30 years together, and she wasn't just my partner, but also the mother of our children. Steve, in his twisted way, was right. Women like Ruby are rare. She possessed intelligence, talent, empathy, and every quality one could wish for in a partner. I tried to treat her with the love and respect she deserved, but her actions towards me showed no reciprocation. My connection to Ruby was profound, which is why her betrayal cut so deeply. It wasn't insecurity that troubled me, but the emotional fallout of her actions. If she wants to be with Steve, it doesn't bother me since the divorce papers are set to be delivered today. I'm anxious to hear from my daughter about how Ruby reacted to this. Meanwhile, I have critical matters to address, such as dividing our property, planning for retirement, and ensuring our children's well-being. These issues require careful thought and resolution as I work to build a stable future. Maya, surprisingly, didn't seem shocked at all. She said she already knew why we had separated and began calling me, eager to learn how I found out about Ruby's infidelity. I explained that Ruby had admitted to being unfaithful. Maya apologized and mentioned she had previously warned Ruby about Steve and advised her to avoid spending time alone with him. Unfortunately, Ruby ignored this advice, but Maya's version of events differed from what Ruby had told me. According to Maya, she and Ruby were happily dancing when Steve joined them and started making advances on Ruby. He kept whispering in her ear, which made me doubt Ruby's claim that he was apologizing. Maya's account painted a different picture, casting doubt on Steve's intentions and Ruby's honesty. Maya tried to intervene, noticing changes in Ruby's behavior. She realized that Ruby enjoyed talking to Steve, which alarmed her. This complicated the situation, raising questions about Ruby's feelings for Steve. When Steve suggested a walk, Ruby sought Maya's advice. Unsure what to do, Maya strongly opposed the idea, warning about Steve's reputation. Despite this, Ruby agreed to the walk. Maya was distracted by friends and didn't immediately notice Ruby's absence. Eventually, she realized Ruby was missing and became worried. She found Ruby and Steve in the college pool locker room, contradicting Ruby's story about being on the lawn. Maya interrupted them, revealing that it was her presence, not Ruby's conscience, that stopped them. Despite the betrayal, I felt a sliver of pride that Ruby confessed her mistakes to me. Knowing the truth brought some comfort, but the pain lingered. Initially, I believed her claim of intoxication, but later realized it was a conscious decision. Their encounter in the college pool highlighted that it wasn't a moment of weakness, but a deliberate choice. Ruby's actions were intentional. After hearing Maya's account, I faced a dilemma. Could I ever consider giving Ruby another chance? I was torn. Ruby had confessed, but Maya's revelations added complexity. Ruby's deception left me reeling. Meanwhile, my children reported that Ruby's mental state was deteriorating. She was deeply depressed and on the verge of self-harm. Learning about her condition, I turned to Maya for support and advice. I explained the previous conversation where Ruby told a different story. I asked Maya to visit Ruby and have an honest conversation. It was clear Ruby was hiding a painful secret. I urged Maya to tell Ruby that I knew the whole truth and had decided not to forgive or rebuild our relationship. I suspected Ruby might be harming herself intentionally, making her well-being my top priority. Ruby hoped for reconciliation, but Maya visited her and reported back that Ruby was on the path to emotional recovery and had signed the divorce papers, which brought some relief. Recent events motivated me to finalize my work commitments. Instead of settling down, I chose a different path. I decided to embark on a solo journey, seeking new experiences and freeing myself from old obligations. The idea of escaping the constraints of a permanent residence brought me joy and promised better mental health. I know I might not be handling everything perfectly, but I'm doing my best in these unpredictable times. I can only hope for the best as I navigate this challenging period. A year has passed, and I want to update you on what's happened. The time felt like it dragged on after leaving our home. I stayed in a hotel for a few months before renting an apartment while the divorce proceeded. I continued working but shifted to clients that allowed me to work from home. This change offered flexibility and helped me adapt to my new life. Regarding the property division, Ruby received half of the money we had saved for our retirement home. Though it was tough to part with that money, I knew a fair split was important. To fairly distribute my remaining share, I decided to split it between my two children. They are old enough and independent, so these funds can be useful for them. Ruby continues to undergo therapy to address her emotional struggles. Maya keeps in touch with her and occasionally checks in on me as well. During one of our conversations, Maya revealed some surprising information about Ruby. It's important to approach this cautiously, as Maya still supports Ruby. But I was open to hearing her out. Contrary to what I believed, there were reasons to doubt how well I knew Ruby. I always considered her strong and resilient, but it seems loneliness played a role in her decisions. According to Maya, Ruby began talking to Steve, and he responded positively. Their relationship seemed to blossom until Steve discovered our impending divorce. Once he found out, his behavior shifted dramatically. He pulled away from Ruby, leaving her confused and heartbroken. Despite her reminders of his previous declarations of love, he confessed that his intentions were never serious. He admitted he didn't want a long-term relationship or marriage because of her strong-willed nature. This revelation left Ruby feeling betrayed and shattered her perception of Steve's intentions. Their relationship turned out to be based on fleeting desires and empty promises, rather than genuine affection and commitment. It's hard to imagine Ruby begging Steve for a relationship, especially given his reputation for insincerity. Steve's true intentions became clear when he revealed he only wanted a physical relationship, disregarding Ruby's need for emotional support. He also mentioned being content with his current living situation, which involved a roommate. All his supposed love and admiration turned out to be a charade, leaving Ruby feeling deceived and insulted. In a final, cruel statement, Steve arrogantly claimed he had achieved his goals and even boasted about outsmarting Ruby. This deeply unsettled her, making her realize she had been duped by his lies and manipulations. A couple of weeks ago, I received an update on Ruby. My daughter had been living with her to offer support during her battle with depression since I left. However, after a year, my daughter reached her limit. Ruby's behavioral changes had become unbearable. Once emotionally strong, Ruby had transformed into someone filled with self-doubt and constantly seeking attention. She had become unpredictable and unstable, displaying hysterical tendencies that strained those around her. Despite my daughter's best efforts, living with Ruby became impossible. This stark contrast to the Ruby we once knew highlighted the devastating impact of her actions and emotional turmoil on her well-being. Ruby's mental state deteriorated, leading to confusion and delirium. She had become a controlling and possessive mother, frequently calling my children if they didn't answer immediately. Whenever my daughter tried to address Ruby's stubborn behavior, Ruby would become distressed and express her fear of losing them. She was deeply terrified by my departure, and my children assured her they wouldn't abandon her. They did everything they could to help her with her depression, but if her controlling tendencies persisted, they might need to reconsider their support. Ruby often engaged in heated arguments with her children, accusing them of not supporting her during her most challenging moments. This behavior was alien to us, and the children were shocked by Ruby's unusual conduct. Eventually, they had a heated confrontation with her, making it clear that her actions had disrupted everyone's lives. Our once caring, reliable, and joyful family had become fragmented and distorted. It was hard for Ruby to accept that her own children held her responsible for these events. 2 weeks ago, my daughter decided to leave home. She informed me she had done everything possible to help Ruby, but couldn't put her own life on hold to care for her. I believe my daughter's decision was reasonable. It's crucial for her to move forward, just as it's essential for Ruby to take responsibility for her life. While it might be natural for someone my age to find some satisfaction in seeing his unfaithful ex-wife suffer, I must admit I felt no joy in this situation. Instead, I felt deep sadness for Ruby and her current state. Her poor decisions have led to a lifetime of suffering, and I genuinely hope she can recover her former self, regaining confidence and strength. Over the past year, I've traveled to 4 different countries. It has been an incredible journey, experiencing diverse cultures, savoring local cuisines, and embracing entirely new ways of life. Initially, I was disappointed to deviate from my retirement plan, which involved being with Ruby. However, I've come to appreciate the opportunity to immerse myself in various cultures and lifestyles. During my travels, I had the pleasure of meeting incredible people from various cities worldwide. Currently, I'm not involved in any romantic relationship, nor am I actively seeking one. I'm open to whatever the future might bring. To be honest, the last 2.5 years haven't seen any major events, except for my extensive travels to over a dozen countries and rekindling my passion for painting. In the past month, I had the chance to see Ruby again after 4 years. This unexpected reunion was prompted by my son's upcoming wedding. He had found his life partner, and 2 months before the wedding, he wished for Ruby and me to meet the girl's parents. Initially, I hesitated, suggesting we meet at the wedding instead, but I eventually agreed to attend this significant event. I realized it wasn't about me, but my duty as a father. A week before the wedding, the girl's parents graciously hosted a dinner for us. Though I had reservations at first, I decided to go at the last minute. It was emotionally challenging to see Ruby again. I would have preferred it to be just the 2 of us, but I knew I had to be there for my son, and both he and his fiancée were thrilled to see me. Her parents left a wonderful impression as kind and hospitable people. When I met the girl's father, we immediately hit it off, having a great conversation about his business. But I know you're more interested in the situation with Ruby, so let's get to that. Upon entering the room, I noticed Ruby seemed visibly uneasy. Something had changed in her eyes. She was no longer the woman I once knew. Although she smiled politely, there was tension in her demeanor. It was clear she had distanced herself from me over time. Despite the years that had passed, Ruby still had her long hair, a constant feature of her appearance. But I couldn't help but notice that these 4 years seemed to have taken a heavier toll on her than I expected. As we sat at the table, it became apparent that my son hadn't disclosed the nature of our past relationship to the girl's parents. This was the first meeting for both sets of parents. While this detail interested me, I didn't foresee any problems arising from it. Initially, Ruby was quiet around others, but when she found a moment to speak to me alone, she commented on my appearance, noting that I looked healthier and more energetic. I agreed, and mentioned that I had intentionally removed all toxic elements from my life. This admission momentarily surprised her, and she discreetly looked around to ensure no one overheard our conversation. She curiously asked about my current romantic status, but I skillfully evaded the question, firmly stating that it shouldn't concern her. Throughout our conversation, I tried to focus on engaging with the other guests rather than on her. When the evening drew to a close and it was time to bid farewell, I warmly embraced everyone present. As we were preparing to leave, I nodded to Ruby and casually told her to take care. She looked surprised and stood up abruptly as I said my goodbyes to the others. Though it happened quickly, I don't think it appeared too awkward to the rest of the group. The meeting with Ruby turned out to be rather uneventful. From her reaction, it seemed she was either caught off guard by my presence or felt too uneasy to engage in a deeper conversation. Whatever she was thinking, I had no desire to explore the matter further and left the gathering. As I exited, my son walked me to the door and kindly invited me to spend a few days with him. Unfortunately, I declined his generous offer but promised to call him soon. With that, I headed back to my hotel. I no longer have a fixed residence. I travel frequently and usually stay in hotels when I return. Transitioning to this nomadic lifestyle was challenging after 26 years of being a dedicated family man. However, over time, I adapted and have come to appreciate the freedom it offers. I have some more news to share. I now have a life partner. 2 years ago, during a trip to Tokyo, I met Emerson, a 52-year-old woman who had recently left an abusive relationship and embarked on her first solo journey. We met while hiking a mountain and formed a genuine connection. Neither of us was looking for a romantic relationship at the time, so we developed a deep friendship instead. After my stay in Tokyo, I planned to head to South Korea, while she intended to visit Thailand. Despite the distance, we kept in touch and nurtured our friendship. Realizing how well we got along, we decided to plan future adventures together. Over the past year and a half, we've traveled to over 8 countries. We became travel companions, focusing on the bond we shared rather than rushing into romance. For the first 2 months, we maintained a platonic relationship by mutual agreement. We weren't in a hurry to get to know each other deeply. Instead, we enjoyed our discoveries and explorations. My children knew about Emerson's presence in my life, but chose not to tell Ruby, fearing it might worsen her depression. When I arrived at the hotel, I called my son to explain why I had declined his offer. I told him that Emerson had joined me on this trip, and it wouldn't be fair to leave her alone. I also expressed my desire for Emerson to attend the wedding as my partner. Although my son liked the idea, he was concerned about how Ruby might react. Nevertheless, I stood firm, emphasizing the importance of Emerson being there and getting to know the family. I suggested my son discuss it with my daughter to reach a collective decision. Thankfully, my daughter supported the idea and agreed that Emerson should meet the family. With only a week left before the wedding, we spent our time exploring the city and giving Emerson a memorable tour of Kentucky, since it was her first visit. Finally, the wedding day arrived. As we walked into the venue, I noticed Ruby's intense gaze fixed on me. Her reaction was strong when she saw Emerson and me holding hands. Before the event, I had warned Emerson about the potential for Ruby to act out, but she reassured me that she could handle it. At that moment, I realized how much control Ruby still had over me, even after our separation. Ruby rushed toward us, grabbing my wrist and trying to pull me aside. I firmly told her I didn't want to have a private conversation. She asked direct questions, demanding to know if Emerson was my girlfriend, and if I planned to marry her. I replied that it was none of her business. With more guests noticing Ruby's tears and anger, I asked her to leave us alone. The wedding was about to start, and her behavior was disrupting the joyful atmosphere. My daughter stepped in, trying to calm her mother, but Ruby resisted. We pleaded with her, stressing that her actions were ruining the wedding for everyone. Ruby raised her voice, showing no regard for the occasion. In response, my usually quiet daughter stood her ground and became firm. Not only did she keep her composure, but she also delivered a stern rebuke to Ruby. I was taken aback by my daughter's unexpected outburst. With controlled anger, she revealed a harsh truth that had long been buried. She reminded Ruby that they were supposed to enter the wedding hall as a family, but Ruby's actions had been a betrayal. My daughter gave Ruby 2 options: accept the situation and move on, or she would be removed from the wedding. The seriousness of her words left no room for argument or further disruption. Initially, I tried to protect my daughter, but I soon saw her resilience and strength in dealing with her mother. With unwavering determination, she confronted Ruby, ensuring her words had impact. Feeling the tension, Ruby finally released her grip on my wrist. We made eye contact, and her face contorted with a mix of anger and hurt. After a moment of silence, Ruby turned and walked away without acknowledging Emerson. To my surprise and relief, my daughter apologized to Emerson on Ruby's behalf. Emerson embraced us both warmly, and I expressed my pride in my daughter's strength and resilience, calling her my soldier. She was visibly moved when I used that term. Ruby had caused a lot of pain but had always expected sympathy and care from certain friends. Over the years, my children didn't have a family home for special occasions due to our circumstances, and I acknowledged my part in that. Throughout the wedding, Ruby grew increasingly irritated by the support I received from our children. She distanced herself, often standing alone or sitting apart, looking more isolated than a mother of the groom should. She even refused to be in the family photo, further highlighting her sense of alienation. A few days ago, Maya called to say Ruby was upset that I was moving on while she remained lonely. I told Maya that my children and I could no longer endure Ruby's constant dramas. I explained that Ruby was on her own path and free to live as she pleased. My focus now is to enjoy the remaining years of my life peacefully. I'm considering being closer to my children and taking responsibility for family gatherings. Even though they are adults, I believe providing a stable environment where they can come together is important. The recent wedding made me realize that a new chapter in life is approaching, where I might become a grandparent. I don't feel the need to inform Ruby about this, and I'm content with that decision. When the time comes, I'll see if Emerson wants to join me in this journey. Maya also informed me that Ruby's condition had worsened, leading to inappropriate behavior and panic attacks. I asked Maya to stay with her, offer support, and promised to reach out to my daughter for additional help. Since my daughter was away, Maya couldn't stay long, leaving Ruby alone in a terrible state. Before the next day, my children and I received devastating news. In a state of mental breakdown, Ruby ran into the road and was struck by a motorcyclist who couldn't avoid her. Ruby, the love of my life and the mother of my children, died instantly. It's incredibly hard for me to talk about it. Her body was terribly injured, resembling a broken doll. While I might blame myself for insisting on bringing Emerson to the wedding, we couldn't have continued to suffer under Ruby's manipulations. Her betrayal started this, and no one else is at fault for the path she chose.